Hey everybody, Susan Beatty here with West Kentucky Gear Up with a new learning opportunity for science teachers. This one has to do with writing learning targets that are meaningful and effective, but also aligned with NGSS or the Kentucky Academic Standards for Science. Now, who is this module designed to help? I'm going to go through this real quickly so that if it doesn't apply to you, you don't have to waste your time looking at the whole thing. However, I think anyone who wants to see improvement in making sure their learning targets do what you intend for them to do, help students meet standards, right? I think it can be helpful to any of you. I think it can help new teachers who are just struggling at the beginning to write learning targets, who just need a starting place. Or it can help teachers who have gotten a new class that maybe they've never taught before and they're writing targets from the beginning and just want some guidance. Or even a seasoned teacher who have used targets a long time and feel like maybe they need to be refined or improved or maybe realigned because they're old. They don't see them maybe as authentic anymore. So I hope all of you, whatever level you are in, you can benefit from considering this topic. And I think there's a few reasons why this topic is important and would be helpful to you and relevant to you. I know many of your principals require you to display your target visibly in the room. When they come in the room, they want to see it. And so if you've got to do that, you might as well make them good. Secondly, we often have difficulty knowing how to write our targets, what language to use, how specific to be, what to include in them, how to format them. All of those questions come to mind. And then we often get frustrated and confused about how to actually do it. And so we throw up our hands and say, I'm not going to try anymore. I'm just going to write what I've got. But there is a better way. And so I want to help you with that. And number three, we want targets to have meaning for our students. That might be the most important one because that's who they're for. And so if they don't have meaning for students, they're not going to be as actively engaged in helping meet those targets. So those are some reasons. And this video and the next one that goes with it are just my attempts to help you with any of these struggles you might be having. So if you're still interested in this topic, continue on and I'll give you some advice, my advice from the things that I've experienced and also the things that I've read and studied on regarding this topic. So in this first video, I'm going to continue on talking about what a 3D learning performance is and how it's different from a performance expectation and how it might be a better option in writing your targets that way. Instead of just using the performance expectation itself or using a pre-written objective from a textbook or another curriculum document. And then after that video is over, I'm going to put a second video together that gives you some guidance about how to write your own so that you can know how to guide your students and meet those targets better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, so that you can see the full screen, I'm going to take myself off. You don't want to look at me, I know. And we'll get started in learning about daily learning targets in science. So why am I emphasizing learning targets? Aren't there other things that I could be telling you, things that are more important? Possibly. But I think learning targets is where we start with students. And so it's always a good idea to make sure we've got those right and remember and remind ourselves what the purpose of them are and see whether they're doing the job that we write them to do. So I'm going to give you 3 sentences here, and I want to see if any of these apply to you. I already know how to write learning targets. I've done it for years. I've already have them in my units. I use I can statements for learning targets. I just summarize the overall lesson of the day. They're easy to write. My learning targets are the objectives found in my textbook or curriculum. They're written for me. Not that any of those are bad statements or statements that you're wrong to have. They're not, because I've had them myself. But I want you to evaluate that and decide if that's really what we want our learning targets to be. If we want to just ignore them and go on, or we really want to examine them and see if they're doing what we want them to do. Because if we think about, and here's one more, sorry. I just used the NGSS PE statements. Aren't those targets? Aren't those the targets? And so I want you to think about these 4 sentences. Are they really the attitude or really the thought we want to have about our targets? Wrong with that? Okay, there we go. But, sorry about that. But can you say these things? Students pay attention to my learning targets, which helps motivate their learning. Or I'm confident that my students can meet my learning targets and they will have a strong understanding of the content I want them to learn, as evidenced in my assessments. I would hope that you would be able to say those things about your learning targets. And if you can't and you want some help with that, continue on and I'll give you some advice and some strategy, some help to maybe make your learning targets a little better, more effective, more meaningful, and make the experience for you and your students a little bit better. So let's talk about targets for just a moment. Targets have purposes. Targets have purpose, whether it's a target for a bow and arrow you're shooting at, or if it's a learning target. They're meant to be hit with accuracy. And the thing about a target is, even if you don't hit the bullseye every time, you can still see what level of learning you've done based on where you hit the target. That's why we have rubrics, right? Rubrics tell us how accurate we are with our meeting our target. Same thing with shooting an arrow into a target. If you hit the bullseye, you hit it right in the middle, you got it. If you're a little on the outside, you got a little more work to do as far as being a little more accurate. So in the classroom, targets are guidance about what is to be learned. And when targets are meaningful and intentional, students have a better chance of meeting the big target, which is the performance expectation of the NGSS. It's just that the way the performance expectations in the standard documents are written are not really meant to be day-to-day lesson targets. And I'll hit that here in just a moment a little bit more. But keep in mind that targets have purpose and they're meant to be hit with accuracy. So they need to be written, learning targets need to be written that way. So what's my message here overall? When learning targets are meaningful to students, they can be an effective engagement tool because they have meaning. And when learning targets are written intentionally to meet part of a big performance expectation, students are more likely to hit that target. So before we talk about a better way to think about and construct learning targets, let's talk about why some of the other ways might not be as effective. So I'm going to talk about two. I'm going to talk about using the pre-written targets or objectives from your book or your curriculum and using the performance expectations themselves as targets. So let's think about pre-written targets from the book or resource. These may be good targets. I'm not going to say right out that all of those are bad and that you should never use them. So don't just throw them away and not consider them at all. But remember, targets need to be meaningful and they need to connect to the experience that you're giving students in your class during your lesson. So you need to really think about, do the pre-written targets do this? Also, targets need to maintain the 3D nature of the original performance expectation. So if you borrow it from your curriculum or your textbook or another resource, make sure that this is true. And so my advice would be, don't just assume that those pre-written targets are going to be effective and meet the standard or meet the target you want them to be. Check them out. And then if you want to borrow and use them, that's fine. Just make sure that you adjust them so that they are the way they need to be for your lesson. And then the other one is using NGSS performance expectations word for word. Why would we not use those as our daily learning targets? Well, pretty much they're too broad and they're very wide ranging. There is no way that a student can master one of those performance expectations in a single lesson or a day. It's going to take multiple activities, multiple experiences, multiple days for them to meet one of those big PEs. So if you just write the PE on the board, it's not going to have any meaning because students are not going to make the connection between what they're doing that day in your class with that big, broad target. Secondly, often the performance expectations are what students should know and be able to do, right? And that gives away what it is they need to be figuring out during their exploration, their investigation, their research, whatever you're giving them to do in class, whatever kind of data manipulation, interaction you're giving them to do. If you've given them the result up on the screen or up on the board, you've left very little for them to figure out. And we want them to have the experience of working like a scientist to discover what is unknown to them. So keep that in mind as you think about using PEs word for word. And I'll say this, that sometimes big challenges are best overcome in smaller segments. And writing targets, learning targets for individual daily lessons or series of daily lessons is a big task, because the huge performance expectations are a bit overwhelming, and it's hard to pick out what it is from those you want to target and still maintain the three-dimensional aspects of it. But it's really a good approach if you want to increase achievement and see results rather quickly, because making the target a smaller bite at a time and then combining each of those small bites into one big piece, it makes it easier for you to plan them in small amounts. It's easier for students to meet them in small amounts. And then again, when you combine them together, they've met the big overall expectation on the standard. So how should I write my own targets so that they're meaningful to students and they keep the 3D intent and they help me accurately assess what students have learned? That is the big question here now that you probably have, as I've talked about all of this about three-dimensional learning performances. You should write your own three-dimensional learning performances if you can't find what you're looking for otherwise. Simply put, a 3D learning performance is a broad NGSS performance expectation broken down into smaller, more manageable targets based on students' own questions about the phenomenon. Before I get into the students' own questions about phenomenon aspect, let me just say that one broad NGSS performance expectation might have 2 or 3 or 4 or more 3D learning performances under it, those small bites. And when you put those small bites together, you get the big performance expectation. Okay, just wanted to make that clear. Now, the part about based on students' own questions about the phenomena leads me to remind you about what kind of instruction you should be doing three-dimensionally. So you're saying, what do you mean that students help make the learning target? Kind of. You already know an idea of what you want students to do. You're just letting them in on it some. So remember this. Phenomena-driven instruction is driven by student questions and promotes sense-making and figuring out. You don't just stand and deliver and give them the information and ask them to learn it. You let them have experiences that allow them to figure out. So this little flowchart or diagram kind of shows you that. You start with engagement up here, and you engage them with a big phenomena that they need to explain. And it's got science in it that you try to get them to figure out as they engage with it or as they explore it. The engagement part is to get them interested, to pique their curiosity, to get them to ask questions. And when they start asking questions with your guidance and your direction, you write all those questions down. This DQB is a driving question board, and I could do a whole other segment just on that part. So if you're interested in that, check that one out too. But you write down all of those questions, and those are the questions that I'm talking about when I say students' own questions about the phenomenon. Through your guidance, you help students use their own questions to decide what it is they want to learn or what it is they need to learn in order to figure out the answer to those questions. So you give them activities to explore, to research, to analyze, to practice, to experiment, so they can gather evidence. All right. And I'm going to go back and talk here in just a minute about how to fit the target in with that. Because once they gather evidence, then they can explain. And when they explain, you assess their explanations. And that's going to tell you where they are in meeting the target. Keep in mind, you're already going to know a general idea of what the targets will be before you introduce any of this to the students. But this first step is important because it gets them interested and engaged. It lets them in on the target development, and it's based on their own questions. So they think that they have an investment. They're curious. They've asked that question, and they're actually getting to explore it with your guidance. So just a few things to remember as you consider what targets you want your students to have, because you need to have an idea of that before. You need to know, what targets do I want them to try and meet, and how am I going to guide them to get to those targets? Remember, you want to keep the 3D component in the target. You want the disciplinary core idea and the science and engineering practice and the cross-cutting concept from your original PE that you're trying to meet. You want to keep those in your little bitty small bite targets. Because remember, the standards are three-dimensional, the state summative assessment is three-dimensional. You even can include some classroom embedded three-dimensional assessments in your class. So your instruction should be three-dimensional too, and your targets should align with that as well and be 3D. So keep that in mind. And also remember, here's our chart. Remember that during instruction, you give students activities that are going to help them meet the targets. Activities there in the exploration part that will help them meet targets to answer the questions that they've asked, so that they can explain answers to those questions. So after engaging students with a phenomenon, you're going to get them to identify targets. And here is a good way to do that. You ask them the question, what do we need to figure out to help answer the question or questions we want to answer? You get them to look at their driving question board. You guide them to the question that makes the most sense to investigate first, because you're the teacher, you know which questions should be asked or answered first, which questions should be left towards the end, all of that. You may not answer every question they have, but it's your job as the teacher to recognize which questions do we need to answer so they get the science, they get the experience with the practice, they make the connections with the concepts that I want them to do, so that they can meet that standard that is up here that I'm trying to meet ultimately. So you ask them, what do we need to figure out to help answer the question we've identified that we want to answer? And then you can begin your learning target for the day or for the series of days that you put on your board for your principal and everybody to see. Today we are trying to figure out, and then put the rest of that from their question. We are trying to figure out blank. So what that does is it focuses the student on the target. They know what they're supposed to be learning. Anybody that visits your room can see what students are trying to figure out, and you've helped them make the connection with the 3D performance expectation that we have in the standard. How do you represent this in your room? You can do it however you want to. One suggestion is that you create a little space on your board or on your screen where you put the learning target. And you can word it however you want to, but I would always put, what are we trying to figure out today? We are trying to figure out blank. And if you just have to use an I can statement because your principal makes you can word it that way. Put the practice up there. Put modeling or constructing explanations or using math or whatever the practice of the day is that's in that target. And what's the concept? Are we looking at patterns? Are we looking at cause and effect? Are we looking at structure and function? Whatever the concept is, put those up there so students can see that's what they're supposed to be doing. And then always do a double check. Before you actually put it up there, make sure it has all 3 dimensions from the original PE that you want them to perform as they do their activity, as they do their figuring out. Okay, I know that's a lot in one little video, but I'm going to stop here on this one, and then I'll come back and do another one, if you choose to come back and look at it, about how to create those 3D learning performances more specifically. So thank you for watching to the end, and I hope this helps you. Thanks.